bucket. Does that mean that people are paying out of pocket? In other words, are the folks here to assume that if you're not borrowing, that you have a full tuition payment available in your bank account that you're ready to hand over to a law school?
Yeah, I think everybody wishes that was
I
the
wish.
case. And to be clear, that is true. Some people will not borrow at all. Some people will borrow a lot, but the vast majority of people, it's going to be a combination of borrowing and not borrowing. So we're going to start by talking about the non-loan resources that are out there, typically known scholarships and grants. And I just want to give you financial aid, like many things, has, its own little lingo, its own language, certainly lots of acronyms. So I feel like understanding the language and definitions are part of the tools that you should understand so that when you're speaking for yourself, advocating for yourself, you're asking for the right things. So let's start with grants. Grants typically implies need-based gift money, meaning money that you would not have to repay, that is awarded on the basis of financial need. Okay. If some of you from your undergraduate educations, maybe you received a Pell Grant, which is a federal grant money, or a state grant, or some other grant that's based on, probably as an undergraduate, the completion of the FAFSA, which we'll spend a little bit of time talking about, the free federal application form. In the law school world, there isn't really any federal grant money. There is minimal state grant money that will be very dependent upon the state in which you live in and study in. The biggest bucket of grant money might come from the law schools themselves. And you'll know that they have such a fund, grant funds, if they're asking you to fill out maybe a separate application that's going to ask you about your financial circumstances. You should be warned that even though you're all adults and you're all looking at attending professional school, some law schools may require that you complete your parental information on there, even though you are not a dependent anymore. And the reason for that is because if you think about the people who are going to attend law school, everybody's financial situation, really almost everybody's financial situation, looks pretty bleak. Because they're going to, even if they're working full-time now, they're probably going to be attending full-time, except for the segment of law students that attend part-time. And so they're not going to continue working full-time. So sometimes schools are asking for historic financial information because that gives them a better idea of who really is coming from a needy circumstance versus somebody who maybe comes from a wealthy background, but they themselves don't work, right? But because they're independent, it looks like they don't have any financial resources. So that is grant money. That you can think about then in terms of scholarships, which typically refers to, again, gift money, money that you won't have to repay, but that is awarded based upon merit. Okay. Merit in the undergraduate world has specific meanings. It may include athletic scholarships, right? That's meritorious for playing a sport, maybe, or other things at the undergraduate level. In legal education, going to law school, typically merit awards are going to be based upon either quantitative scores and grades, GPA and LSAT, for example, or sometimes qualitative references, resume experiences, other holistic factors, specific areas of study that a student may be going into. So those are the kinds of things that will be very individual, very unique, depending upon the law schools that you actually apply to, that you should take the time to research on the individual law school sites that you're applying to. Be sure that you watch out for deadlines, which are very important in the financial aid world, that you understand if there's a separate application process. A lot of specifically scholarships in the law school world, you're applying basically with your admissions application, but sometimes there are separate applications, so you need to watch out for them. And you should know the good news is that a lot of, especially full-time enrolled law school students, do receive some sort of institutional grant or scholarship funding. The share of full-time students receiving any institutional grant money in 2022, which is the statistics I'm most recent for, was 80%, right? So that's a lot of people, a lot of law school folks getting some level of assistance. Then again, you should know that it drops only about 6% receive full tuition, right? So it's probably not probably right if you're thinking, well, that's how I'm going to get there. That's the only way I'll do it. So you have to understand those differences. Another thing that students will use to help them sort of in the non-borrowing area are employer tuition reimbursement. So for those of you who might be thinking about part-time attendance and you're going to keep working, a lot of employers have some reimbursement for tuition. And then those of you who will continue to work, but as a full-time student, maybe working part-time, then, you'll be able to engage in some off-campus work, although your law schools will probably be telling you to keep the hours as minimal as you can, especially in your first year of law school, when it will take a lot of concentration. In terms of loans, there are a variety of federal loans out there. We're going to dig more into that as we get through the webinar. But to give you an idea, many students borrow, as we talk about. Nearly half of all enrolled law students have undergraduate debt. 46% come in with that debt. And the average amount owed from their undergraduate education is around $28,000. So you can see that, there's a lot of money being borrowed for law school education. And again, LJ is going to be our expert here. But again, I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning and then move off to the next person, which is a majority of law school graduates did borrow at some point in their legal education. So that is something that you can kind of expect to do.
Right. So while there are options that exist, namely scholarships and grants, income that you might have from employment during law school, and then you also mentioned fellowships, employer tuition reimbursements. While those exist, there's also quite a bit of funding. A lot of people do get that loan money, which we'll be talking about later on, right? That's
right. And it's the idea that it's usually going to be a combination. There's going to be some grants and scholarships, hopefully, but then there's going to be some loans, and then there's going to be some work, and it's all going to come together. That's why they call it a financial aid package.
Exactly. What other elements of that financial aid package could exist? Karen, what other sources of non-borrowed funding could people look for when getting ready to pay for law school?
Well, one other source that comes to mind is work study or school employment. We often refer to it as student employment. It universally is interchangeably used to describe working on campus, paid at an hourly rate. Now, the thing is, most law schools will have a policy that you're either not working at all your first year or you're working very little. And that's to make sure that you're focusing on your studies, of course. But then common opportunities after your second semester would be working as a research assistant to a faculty member, working in perhaps the IT area, if that's your forte, admissions, or perhaps working in the school's library. And the difference between work study and school student employment is the funding source. Work studies referred to often, federal work study is the official term, and that would be a financial aid award. And you must possess financial need to be eligible. You'd have to check with the individual school, but many schools will hire the student and then pay them accordingly. If you're eligible for work study, you'll get work study or federal work study. And if you're not eligible for federal work study, they'll pay you out of the school resources. But again, you would check the individual schools. I'll mention a few other things that are very specific to certain groups of students, if I may continue.
Please.
We have tribal funding. And that, of course, there's three different things that kinds that come to mind. The American Indian College Fund, the American Indian Graduate Center Graduate Fellowship, and the Native Forward Scholars Fund. We will be including the links, I believe, for you, and you'd have to check the deadlines and the specific requirements, but some of these offer scholarships to certain tribal colleges or non-tribal colleges that are accredited nonprofit colleges throughout the U.S. To American Indian and Alaska Native students. If I could say that correctly, yes. Another group of students are veterans. Thank you for your service. If you're a veteran or someone in your family has transferred benefits to you, you may be eligible to use these benefits towards law school. A great source of information and where you would get started is at va.gov/education. If you're a veteran and you're eligible at the 100% level, you'll know what that means. 100% level means that you would likely be eligible for the Yellow Ribbon program as well. And that Yellow Ribbon program will provide a certain amount of money to cover whatever the post 9/11 benefits don't cover, split between the school and the VA. Each school has its own policy. It could mean that if you're a Yellow Ribbon eligible student, you may not have to pay anything towards tuition and fees. So you would check each school's website. You can also compare schools on the VA website. I think there's one more I wanted to mention, and that's for our DACA students. You'll have to look into non-federal sources of aid, such as scholarships, and the best source would be to go to each school to see if they have a scholarship program specific for DACA students, or perhaps if they could refer you to a private lender.
Thank you, Karen. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight before we transition into the conversation about loans, because we've talked a lot about the non-borrowing aspect of this, but I want to make sure we talk about that as well, is that there are a variety of options, right? That it's not just scholarships. So I think it's what a lot of people think. There are other ways that you can pay for law school without borrowing, even though borrowing is a common tool. And I think a quick question for both of you, and that is, how competitive are these different sources of funding for law school? Is it something that, it's a very limited pool and you've got to apply early, or what is your experience, and what advice might you have for these folks trying to figure out how to obtain these sources of funding?
I think we'd both agree the biggest thing you can do for yourself is to check the deadlines on everything. Make sure you have the applications in on time. There might be more opportunity for student employment versus a particular specific scholarship that you see out there. But I think checking deadlines is probably the best advice we can give you.
Fantastic advice. Giselle, I'm nodding, so I'm assuming you agree completely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that it's always important for you to sort of look at your unique self and see, especially when we get to the sources that Karen was speaking about, which of those you might be eligible for based on sort of your individual circumstances. That said, in the law school world, and that's why we talk about it this way, the largest single source of non-loans, of non-borrowing resources is going to be the individual law schools themselves with their grant and scholarship programs. So in some ways it helps you, and I'm so, glad that we have a large percentage of sort of students who are even looking at next year. When you think about that, think about the schools you think you're going to apply to and start looking at what their grants and scholarships are now. Like, it's all on their websites. We're going to talk about resources. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, where you can sort of gauge how hard it is to get a scholarship at an individual school. You can start to look at that, a year in advance, 2 years in advance. Things change, but not dramatically in most cases. So that's where you want to have your eye on. And I'm just going to reiterate what Karen said. Most important thing is going to be deadlines.
And I'm sure, just to drive this point home, always talk to the law schools, right? Reach out to the law schools and talk to them if you have any questions in advance of applying or starting there, right? I'm sure the financial aid offices are always willing to have these conversations with potential prospective students, right?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to shift our focus toward that that source of funding for law school that, Giselle, you've already mentioned, and you've already talked about the folks, the number of folks who pursue this option when deciding how to pay for law school, and that is the borrowing option, taking out loans to pay for law school. And this makes me flash back again to that experience in undergrad where I was thinking about how am I going to pay for it, and I thought that I would get scholarships, pay for it out of pocket, but then I realized that I wasn't going to have enough. And then I did some exploration and I realized that loans were an option, and it was a decision that I ultimately ended up making. And I'm grateful for it because I was able to get the education that I wanted. Giselle, you already mentioned that a lot of people find themselves in the same situation that I did, and you shared that number, that percentage of people. It's worth mentioning one more time before I ask Karen a question. What percentage of people is it that end up taking out loans for law school?
71% across all schools. It's slightly higher at private law schools and slightly lower at, actually 76%. It was 71% at the publics, slightly higher at privates. So I want to throw out some data and then pass it to Karen, who's going to give more specific information about the loans that exist. The data I wanted to give, because again, I'm here to partly be the sobering one to help people sort of understand. And the data that I'm going to share with you now is the average full-time tuition and fees of law schools. So again, you get a sense of each of, if you're going to be full-time, each of my 3 years, what is that total cost for tuition and fees anyway? And how is it that the debt sort of racks up the way that it does, what I mentioned before? So private law schools, the average full-time tuition is almost $56,000 a year. In the public sector for non-residents, meaning if you attend a public law school that you are not a resident of that state, the average is about 43,000, 43,500. And then public resident tuition is 30,500. That's the average, right? So there are going to be some higher, some lower. But again, it speaks to this idea of looking at your financial aid as a package. My expectation and hope is I'm going to get some sort of gift money over here in the form of grants or scholarships. I'm going to get some other money over here, maybe through some work or through fellowships. And then I'm going to get some money over here from my borrowing opportunities. And to talk more specifically about that, I think we're going to go over to Karen, right?
Absolutely. Karen, please, what types of loans exist for people interested in taking out loans for law school?
Sure. There's basically the federal loans and the private loans. I'll talk first about the federal loans. And I'll start talking about the similarities and then the differences. There are 2 basic types of federal loans that graduate students are eligible for, and that would be the direct unsubsidized loan and the direct Graduate Plus loan. Similarly, they are repaid beginning 6 months after graduation or for some other reason that you drop below half time. Currently, they both have loan forgiveness options through the Public Interest Loan Forgiveness Program, and that's available to lawyers working in qualifying public interest positions. They also have deferment and forbearance options to temporarily pause your payments if you have any financial hardship, no prepayment penalties, and flexible payment arrangements when you go into repayment. Now, how much can you borrow, you may ask? On the unsubsidized loan, it's not based on financial need. You may borrow up to $20,500 annually, and that's part of an aggregate limit, total lifetime limit of $138,500 for all unsubsidized or subsidized loans. There's a fixed interest rate throughout the life of the loan. Each year the rate changes, but for that loan, for example, for 24-25, you would have a fixed interest rate that stays that for the entire time that you have that loan. Those rates are set by the federal government, and the interest rate is set, I think, at the end of May. There is a origination fee for these loans of a little over 1% of the loan amount. Graduate Plus loans can help make up the difference of any costs in the cost of attendance minus any other financial aid. And we'll talk about cost of attendance later in the presentation. So that is the loan limit for Graduate Plus loans. The major difference between unsubsidized and Graduate Plus loans is that there is a credit check. However, it's not like buying a car. I like to say it is just checking to make sure that you don't have any adverse credit. Are you paying your bills on time? That's what they're looking for when they do that credit check. Also has a fixed interest rate, generally a little bit higher than, usually 1% higher than the unsubsidized loan. And this loan does have a higher origination fee of a little over 4%. And then the other kind of loan of the federal loans is a private loan. They may borrow up to the cost of attendance, less any other aid, just like Graduate Plus loan. But here you don't have as many protections with the federal government. Interest rates may be fixed, they may be variable. There's a more stringent credit check, and you may be asked to obtain a co-borrower. So we'll talk a little, I think our next speaker might be talking about the differences a little more in depth about Grad Plus and private loans.
That's absolutely right. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for outlining those different loan types. And I think now you and Giselle get a little bit of a break. You've been carrying the load for the first half here. LJ, I've got some questions for you. I'd really like to understand the difference between these types of loans that Karen just outlined for us. Could you talk us through some of the major differences between federal and private?
Yeah, absolutely. So Karen hit on a lot of the main points there. When I kind of see it in the financial world, I think in general, it is better to get federal loans for a lot of the reasons that Karen laid out. There is a lot more opportunities for deferment, forbearance that may happen if you struggle with hard financial times. If something happens to you with private loans, you are required to make that payment. I think of those people who, right before COVID, they refinanced their federal loans into private loans to get an extremely low interest rate. Maybe a few days later, they issued a COVID forbearance. And so for the next 4 years or so, borrowers didn't have, in the federal system, did not have to make payments. They weren't accruing any interest. However, those borrowers who switched to private loans at that time had to make payments throughout COVID. I'm not expecting any more pandemics, so I wouldn't use that as your financial reason to get federal loans, but that is something to show, or to kind of demonstrate, like, there is a lot of benefits to the federal loan system. On top of that, especially for borrowers going to law school who maybe are trying to do public service route, where they do want to work in a nonprofit or a public entity, if you go to private loans, there is no public service loan forgiveness route for those loans. You have to pay them off in full. However, in the federal system, there are currently ways to work for the federal government or a nonprofit for 10 years, or another state or tribal agency, work for 10 years and get those loans forgiven at the end of time. There's also income-driven repayment plans within the federal system that can lower your payment. Most borrowers are still on track to pay off their loans, but especially in the early years, that can be really advantageous to have a plan that at least gives them some relief and lowers their payments. So in general, the federal loans typically will have lower interest rates and better borrowing terms. And so in that case, federal loans are typically better. There are situations where maybe people aren't eligible for federal loans for some reason, and they need to acquire private loans. And that is certainly not a bad decision, but it is just something to be aware of, that typically there are some downsides. Another downside to private loans that is a very rare situation, but I have seen it come up, is if you have somebody who signs on as a co-writer, or someone on the loan with you, a co-signer. What can happen is there can be a clause in there where there are acceleration provisions in which you might have to pay back the full amount quickly. One of those provisions that I've seen is in the death of the co-signer. So something could happen where the co-signer is a parent who, over the time paying, they pass away. and it could potentially trigger a full repayment of that loan, even though the borrower themselves is healthy and things like that, completely out of their power. Again, it's a very rare situation, but it does kind of just, again, highlight private loans are more restrictive. They do come with probably less freedom and ability to kind of make your law career how you want it to than federal loans. And so in that respect, I think the federal loans are typically better for most borrowers.
Thanks, LJ. And I think what's really nice between what you and Karen and Giselle have just talked about is it kind of starts to set the stage for, as we start thinking ahead and planning, understanding the differences between the different loan types and their availability and eligibility helps you to make an informed decision when it comes time to take out those loans or not, right? So from a long-term planning perspective, what are some things that people should consider before taking out loans to pay for law school? I just mentioned one, understanding the difference between different loan types before you make that commitment. Karen, I saw you unmute yourself. Did you have something you wanted to jump in and contribute there, or just waiting in case I had a question? So Karen, LJ, what advice might you have for someone? What should they be thinking about before taking out a loan for law school?
Well, I've had some students say, I only want one loan, and they'll go right to the Grad Plus loan. And that is, I would not recommend that. Always go with unsubsidized first, borrow what you can up to $20,500. You do have to pay attention to the school's procedures because you do have to accept it every year and apply for Grad Plus every year. So that is one thing. And then I would say clear any consumer debt that you have. Prior to and check your credit report before you apply for a Grad Plus loan, just to make sure that there's not any surprises.
And by consumer debt, just to clarify, you mean like credit cards? What do you mean by consumer debt?
If you can get your balances as low as possible prior to applying to law school. If you're looking to keep your expenses, if you're looking to keep your loan borrowing at the minimum, you want to get rid of what you can before you start borrowing more.
Giselle, you're on
Go ahead, LJ.
Okay. Another thing that I would urge borrowers to think of when they're thinking about taking on debt is to not think of it as this scary thing. Those numbers that are brought out are pretty intimidating initially, especially for most young borrowers. They maybe never even had $100,000 to their name. So to take on $150,000, $200,000 of debt is a bit intimidating. But what I will say is it is an investment in your career and your future income potential. Much like you take out a mortgage to buy a home, you take out a car loan to buy a car, a law school loan is there to give you substantially higher earnings over your career. Give you kind of a sense of what that looks like. The average American, typically their salary is probably around 60,000. That has gone up a little bit, but think of it 60, 65,000. About 50% of law school graduates in the first year will earn over $200,000. If you do take out, as we were saying, $150,000 roughly of law school debt, your average income has increased to $200,000, $150,000 greater than the average salary. You can see how that investment and taking on that debt does pay off over a 20, 30-year career. But be aware that it does cost money. So not go in just taking on debt for the sake of taking it on, knowing, oh, I'll be able to pay for it in the future. Be aware of that, but understand that it is an investment in your future that does pay off.
Yeah, I love that you said that, LJ, because right, that is sort of what I was trying to get at, not half as eloquently as you did, in terms of thinking about the debt, thinking about the cost, in terms of every other decision that you're going to make, and looking at specific law schools and looking at their outcomes and how that works for you individually. The only other thing I wanted to say, because I expected Karen to say it, sort of the sage advice about borrowing for law school and thinking about the cost of law school is plan to live like a student when you're a student so that you can live like a lawyer when you're a lawyer, right? So that is sort of thinking even about the little things, even about your cup of coffee and making it instead of buying it. And all of those little day-to-day things, and Karen talked about clearing up any previous debt that you have, all of that will set you up for success, even in the event that you do borrow to go to law school.
So we're approaching the home stretch of this conversation, and I think one of the important components that we have to make sure we talk about is understanding how much you might need to borrow. We already talked about the cost, as you outlined, Giselle, what the average cost for law school is, but how might people start to, in their planning stage, plan for how much law school might cost so they can understand what type of loan money they might be taking out if they do pursue loans as a source for paying for law school. So Giselle, how can people go about determining how much to budget, how much to borrow, and how much they might need for law school?
Yeah, so I think Karen's going to speak more specifically about cost of attendance, which is another one of those important terms.
Yes.
Before we get there, though, I want to be sure that we get out some of the great resources that exist to help students understand the costs of individual schools and how to sort of look at them through the lens in which we're talking about in terms of that cost benefit kind of analysis. So some of the tools that exist, I will start with LSAC's Candidate Referral Service, which won't give you information about the cost of law schools, but is so important for prospective students to be a part of, to opt into, because it is the place where many law schools, if not all law schools, it's really the vast majority of law schools will send information about their grants and scholarships and sort of get information out to students about what might exist at their individual schools. So be sure to sign up for CRS. Law School Transparency, which is another resource you will find on the LSAC, on the LawHub website, will give you a lot of information that will help you find, discover, compare, and plan for law schools. It provides comprehensive data. It will allow you to compare and customize and format that data. And this includes a lot of information about cost and debt expectations and also information about employment outcomes. And finally, I want to mention the ABA 509 reports, which are required of all accredited law schools, which show just a lot of granular information, information about admissions, acceptance rates, enrollment rates, GPA and LSAT medians, but also tuition, fees, overall cost of attendance for the law school, and very granular granted scholarship data about the number and percentages of students who receive scholarships at different levels, full tuition, half tuition, and so on. And that exists for every single school. So be sure to use those resources.
Those are exceptional resources, and those resources, in addition to being shared in the chat or in the resource center for you all today, are included in that course as well. So you can see them in the context of the information that we've shared today, when those resources would be super valuable, in addition to what Giselle just said. You're absolutely right. You mentioned, and as part of the utility of these resources, thinking about the cost of attendance, and you promised that Karen would get into that a little bit more. So I'm going to follow through on that promise. Karen, can you break down a little bit more what cost of attendance is and what a potential applicant to law school or potential law school student might see in that cost of attendance breakdown?
Sure. You're going to see two different sections. It might be listed all in one spot, but I mean, it will be listed in one spot, but it's going to be broken down by tuition and fees. You have no control over that. These are direct expenses, things that you'll pay directly to the law school. And then you may see something for health insurance. Many schools will ask you to take their health insurance unless you have other health insurance, and then you would waive that. And the rest of the costs are generally indirect costs, things that aren't billed by the school, but they're things that you're going to have to pay for over the time you're in law school. An example would be housing, food, personal expenses, miscellaneous, I need a suit for an interview kind of thing. Or I need to get to school in my car, the transportation. Those are all valid expenses, and that is kind of what makes up the whole package of how much it will cost you per year to attend law school. It's your guideline. And this is normally where I talk about buying a cup of coffee once a week versus every single day. Make it at home, trim your expenses as much as possible. That cost of attendance drives how much you can borrow, because that will be the cap of what you can borrow. So you're going to need to look at the housing costs in the area. Do you need a roommate? Do you need to have two roommates? Do you need to live at home a little longer? All these different things that you'll have to consider. I haven't mentioned books and supplies, but that is also something you'll need to consider. Those expenses for books and supplies, excuse me, can be either through the school. They won't be billing you for that, but you can also buy it other places as well. So I wanted to say that just because the school is offering you a large amount to borrow, doesn't mean that you have to take it. You could always reduce it. You could always increase it later, as long as you're not doing it after you've, left for summer vacation.
What might be a circumstance in which someone wouldn't need to take out the full amount that a law school is thinking? You mentioned, obviously, not buying your coffee every day. That's one small way to save money. Might be another way where students could save a little bit of money to live like students.
The biggest component of that cost of attendance is where you're going to live. How much you will pay for your monthly expenses. It'll be different for everybody. Especially if you have a spouse or a significant other that you're living with and you have purchased a home. If you have any kind of difficulty being within the budget that the school has set, you can always call the financial aid office and work with them on that. But I think that you could also look at different transportation options. You could look at how much it costs to park at the law school. You could ask for gift cards every single holiday. You're not buying many extra things. We don't want you to be unhappy though, so pick your one thing as opposed to many different things. Maybe it happens to be that coffee or a movie or something else, but just live like a student.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm sure when you're looking at these cost of attendance, these reports, and you're thinking about cost of attendance, it's probably valuable to look at schools side by side when you're making a decision about where to apply and attend. School tools like Law School Transparency, for example, is a great way to do that. Giselle, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you've said it. I know that we're running short on time, so I know we want to get to questions too.
Yes, absolutely. So, and with just in 3 minutes or so, I think it's valuable for us to kind of take this information and sort of distill it down into some semblance of a plan. How can people use this information to start to budget and plan for the next potentially 3 years of their lives, or 4 years or 5 years, depending how far you are away from starting law school? LJ, I'm going to look to you one more time. What are some strategies, some budgeting strategies you might recommend for some of the attendees today who are planning to attend law school?
Yeah, great question. So what I would say is the first thing is get down what your needs are. For people, this can be something like health insurance. If you're under the age of 26, you're probably on your parents. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. If you're over that, you're going to probably go with the school's healthcare plan, unless maybe your spouse or someone also has healthcare that they can bring you in. Be aware of that cost. For rent, a great way to do it is if you're looking to go to law school this year, start going on Zillow, start going on those websites and just seeing what is the cost to rent for a place that's affordable and also fits your needs. If you are someone who likes to live by yourself and feels like you'll study better without a roommate, be aware that you might have to sacrifice the size of the place or something, but that can be very valuable because ultimately doing well, especially your first year of law school, pays off tremendously in the future. So do try to find a need that doesn't ever make you feel like you're cost insecure, because that added pressure of worrying about your finances on top of the law school pressures is unnecessary and doesn't need to be there. So be aware of that. Once you have rent, every time you go to the grocery store, start to figure out, how much do I spend a month on groceries? If I like to go out, how much would I be willing to spend going out or something like that? These are all things that are really important. Another one, bills and utilities. How much is your phone bill? If you need to pay for utilities, count for that as well. And then once you have that kind of need-based budget, what I would say is add 10% onto that for personal expenses. Some people could maybe do 20%, but add 10%. This will be to go out with your law school friends to, a bar or something, just to like catch up and things like that. You do want money if you're traveling or if you're driving, you may need car repairs or something. Be aware that these things can come up. And so you do want to be aware of that. Once you have a good idea of what your monthly expenses are, it's important to try to stick to that once you're in law school. And, some things like rent and other things will just kind of be automatically paid out, but those personal expenses, that can be really hard to manage sometimes. Another personal expense that I will mention that a lot of people don't think about is travel for holidays and things like that. If you are living in San Francisco, but you're going to law school in Texas, you may want to fly back once or twice a year to see family for the holidays or something like that. Consider that too in your cost. Be aware of that. And once you're going through those weekly spending, you have that idea of that discretionary spending. Best thing that I've seen for people to do is say, okay, I have given myself $150 a week to pay. What I recommend is people do one of two things. Either every Sunday, go to an ATM and withdraw $150, put it in your wallet. That is your $150 to spend. So if by Thursday you look in your wallet and you have $20 left, that means you're probably going to have to do that. That doesn't include food and stuff. That's just like going out or going to places, traveling, whatever it is that you want to do with your own time. That's a really great way to track your spending and make sure those personal expenses don't get out of touch, because the number one problem I've seen for people graduating law school is not their student debt, but they graduate with lots of credit card debt because they overspent. One more thing that I will also say is make sure that you plan for those summers, because you won't have money, and especially for things like that summer after your 3L year where you're studying for the bar. Not only do a lot of lawyers have to pay for their bar study, but they also have to basically get by while they are waiting for their job to start and that paycheck to come in. A lot of lawyers in that time get into credit card debt. So when you do your 2L internship, if you get paid, your 1L internship, try to keep some money in savings for that 3L summer, because I have seen numerous people come to me with lots of credit card debt that they racked up, and that is very difficult to get out of once you start to get paid.
Thank you, LJ. Those are some great tips that even for me, and I'm not planning to go to law school, to just keep in mind, making sure I'm not overspending on certain things. So we have about 3 minutes for some questions. We're going to answer as many as we can in 3 minutes, but the good news is our back channel team has been doing a great job of answering questions. So if we didn't answer it live, likely someone behind the scenes has answered it for you. So hopefully you got the answer you're looking for. So quick question that's come in a lot. Giselle, I'll go look to you to this one, or maybe Karen, I'll look for you. Do undergraduate loans affect the loans I might take out for law school?
Karen,
You can
go.
defer your undergraduate loans while you're in law school, so you're not making a payment if you'd like to do that. They are a part of the aggregate loan limit of $138,500. Parent loans are not a part of your aggregate if your parent borrowed for you, so it's only your loans that will play a part. But generally, for 3 years of law school, you will have enough in the unsubsidized loan, or 4 years if you're part-time.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Giselle, this question's for you. Someone has asked, or several people have asked about the employer tuition reimbursement. Could you clarify how that might work for those who are maybe currently employed and looking to go to law school?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of employers, although not as many as used to be, it is one of those benefits that I think used to be much more widespread. But there are still, I think, typically larger corporations have tuition reimbursement for students, for employees. Sometimes it is very specific in that it can only be for education that can be used towards advancing you in your job. But sometimes it is more widespread and just available for people who are trying to go to school for anything. So the place to find out will be at your individual employer in the HR area and the human resources area.
Thank you. And this builds off of something that LJ mentioned, and that's around internships. But I'm going to look to you, Karen, as someone who's currently at law schools. Should students plan for a paid summer internship during law school? Is that something they can count on?
Karen, do you
It
want to go?
depends. That's the answer we give in financial aid. It
Yeah.
depends. A lot of it depends on your career goals. If it's a
Mhm.
public interest type position, it may not be paid.
Right.
But a lot of law schools have public interest programs that will help supplement your and provide some funding for you to take those unpaid employment positions during the summer.
Right. And I think an important point to drive home there is that while those possibilities exist, it's similar to what LJ, to the salary figures that LJ pointed out. It depends on what field you get into. It depends on what your goals are, what programs you are in. Those things ultimately affect what your employment outcomes look like, what you're in summer and after, and what your salary might be. And, when we're talking about averages, there's numbers higher and there's numbers lower. And it's important to bear that in mind and think about what type of career you want to get into after law school when you're thinking about paying back your loans down the line.
I
And
do
it's a good
want to
question
jump,
to ask the law schools.
right. I want to jump in and just say, because I know we're running short on time, but it helps to bring it all together. That's such an important point that I think people really need to walk away with. It's not just sort of the cost of law school. Like, this is a whole big picture. What is the cost? Why am I choosing a law school? What is the outcome at that law school for what it is I think I want to do, where it is I want to live, how much I can expect to be making to pay off that indebtedness that I'm deciding about sort of my tolerance and risk level for it. And so you've got to do your homework. You're going to be lawyers. This is an analytical task of using all the resources that are out there. It's all very transparent to sort of hone in on what would be, and there'll be more than one law school, but to figure out that set of law schools that sort of meet all those needs for you.
I think that's a fantastic point to conclude today's session on. I want to thank you, Giselle and Karen and LJ, for your contributions today. I feel like we painted a really nice picture for the people here today about what the cost of law school looks like and how they can plan to pay for it, either by borrowing or not, and what it looks like for people who go to law school, the typical experience looks like in terms of how they get their funding for law school, and importantly, how they can plan now for financial stability in law school and beyond. So I'm going to thank everyone for joining us today. We've got a last couple poll questions that we're going to launch as you all leave today. I want to thank you all for listening as our three panelists shared their expert advice, guidance, information around how to pay for law school. I hope you take advantage of the resources that we shared with you today, including our course, How Do I Pay for Law School? And How Do I Apply to Law School for those of you who are a little earlier on your journey to law school. There's a tremendous amount of resources and information available to you through LawHub and LSAC. And as always, please make sure you reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns that we didn't get to address today. You can reach us at lsacinfo@lsac.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. Our team of dedicated professionals are here to help you. And of course, you can reach out to folks like Karen at the law schools and they will be happy to answer your questions as well. I hope to see you on our next live event on March 5th. And that is How Do I Choose a Law School? We've got a whole series of live events coming your way over the next 12 months. So please make sure you check out LawHub for up-to-date information about live events and beyond. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.